Okay, so the next type of proofs we're going to go over are proving lines parallel. So every proof that we've done so far has dealt with angles. We've either proved that angles are congruent or we proved that angles add to 180. Okay, and so we have used the theorem every time if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then alternate interior, alternate exterior, or corresponding angles are congruent, or we use that consecutive angles add to 180. Today we're going to use the reverse of that, called the converse. We are going to use the statement if alternate interior, alternate exterior, or corresponding angles are congruent, then that means our lines are parallel. So we're going to have to shift from what we've been thinking to a different mentality, okay? So the first couple I'm just going to do for you so you can kind of see what the path, how it goes, and then I may test your knowledge and see if you know how to do it, okay? So in the very first one, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and draw our T-chart, and we're going to label it statement and reason. Okay, so how many steps have our proofs been having? Four, okay? We're still going to have four. So go ahead and do your first one. What is our first always?
Our given.
Our given. So we're going to do A is parallel to B, and angle 2 is congruent to angle 8. And we know that because it's given. Okay? Then for these proofs, we're going to go ahead and fill in our fourth step as well. So what will our fourth step always be? The proof. So our proof is C is parallel to D. Okay? And then the reason is going to be the converse. So write the converse as I write the converse. Okay, so you'd put if blank, then, oh, hold on. If blank angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel. Okay? Because a lot of people get confused with whether the third or the fourth step comes first. And so if you go ahead and write this, it's going to keep you knowing which one is first. Okay, so now let's look at what they gave us. And then we can prove. So it tells me that A and B are parallel. So if A and B are parallel, what are my transversals? C and D. So go ahead and circle those transversals because you can only work along those transversals. Okay? Now, the two angles we're using are the only two that they gave us, 2 and 8. So I'm going to circle 2 and I'm going to circle 8. Then I want to find an angle in one of the transversals that has a relationship. I can either work in this one, find a relationship with 2, or work in this one and find a relationship with 8. So Trey, what do you want to do? Angle 4 has a relationship to what? Angle 8. What's the relationship? Very good. So these are corresponding. That is going to be my second step, is just finding this relationship here. So I'm going to go ahead and write down, I know that angle 4 is congruent to angle 8. And it's because if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then corresponding angles are congruent. Okay, now I'm trying to get from 8 to 2 but they're on different transversals, okay? So I can't just say, oh yeah, 4 and 2 are corresponding, because they don't actually have a relationship, because these are not parallel. So what I would do is I'd take my information from the beginning. So angle 2 is congruent to angle 8. I also found that 8 is congruent to what? 4. So I'd put congruent to 4. So what does that mean about angle 2 and angle 4? They're congruent, because that if they're all congruent like this, that means the congruency transfers over, right, by transitivity. So these are congruent. That's my third step, is that angle 2 is congruent to angle 4 by transitivity. Okay, and so if 2 and 4 are actually congruent, that means that they do have a relationship. Okay, and so what would this relationship be from 4 to 2? Corresponding. Okay, so that means C and D are parallel, because if corresponding angles, which is our last step, are congruent, then the lines are parallel. Okay? I know this is very different from what we've been doing. So we're going to do a couple, and then if we need to ask questions, we can. So let's look at 2. So in number 2, we want to go ahead and draw our 2-column chart. Label it statement and reason. Okay, I can go ahead and write down my first step. What is my first step always? My given. So P is parallel to M, and angle 3 is congruent to angle 8. And I know that's true because it's given. Okay? And then what else should we go ahead and write so we don't get confused? Okay, our prove. So our fourth step is going to be J is parallel to K. And then what should I write? Go ahead and write in my reason. If blank angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel. That way I don't get the transitivity step and this one confused. Okay? So let's go back to the information that I'm given up here at the top. I have that P and M are parallel. So if P and M are parallel, then what lines are actually my transversals? J and K. So do not try to solve these without circling your transversals. I told the last class that, and they still did. And then when I checked them on a problem, they got it wrong. So make sure that you circle those transversals, because it makes your life a lot easier. Okay? What are the only two angles I'm working with? 3 and 8. So go ahead and circle 8 and 3. Okay, now I'm either looking at this transversal or this transversal, and I need to find an angle that either 8 is congruent to or 3 is congruent to. Eli?
3 and 1.
Okay, 3 and 1. How are those related? They are corresponding. Very good. Okay, so I'm going to write that step down. I know that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3 because if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then corresponding angles are congruent. Okay. Now, I want to find a relationship from 1 to 8, but I cannot hop from transversal to transversal. So I'm going to have to do it a different way than finding a relationship. So I'm going to go back to the information I'm given at the top. Angle 3 is congruent to angle 8, okay? And then we found that 3 was also congruent to what? 1. So if angle 1 is congruent to 3 and 3 is congruent to 8, that means that that congruency would transfer over, right? And so that would make angle 1 congruent to angle 8. So that's what I would write next. Angle 1 is actually congruent to angle 8. We know that through transitivity. Okay, so if 1 actually has a relationship to 8, what would that relationship be? Corresponding. Okay, and so where does this last angle relationship go? Where I need some type of angles are congruent. So our last step is if corresponding angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel. So you're proving that these two angles that are not on the same transversal are congruent, so you can prove that the lines are actually parallel. Okay? Do we have any questions on any of the steps that we took in that one? Yes. The third step?
No, the first one,
You forgot to write down this third step right here? Okay, go ahead and write it down. Yes, Anais?
How do you determine which angle to put first and put angle 1 is congruent to angle 3 to angle 8, or does it matter if you angle 3 is congruent to angle 8?
When you're looking at the statement, you write what you were given at first. So angle 2 is congruent to angle 8, and then you look at your second step. 8 is congruent to 4, so you'd have to put 4 on the side with 8, not with the side with 2. Does that make sense? So you put it with what it's congruent to. That was a good question. Okay, Jacob, you got that? Okay, let's try another one. So let's look at number 3. We are going to go ahead and draw our T-chart. We're going to label it statement and reason. Okay, Darius, what is the very first thing that I want to do? Write down the given. So I'm going to write R is parallel to H, and angle 3 is congruent to angle 12. And I know that's true because it's given. Okay, Hannah, what else do I want to go ahead and write down? The fourth step. So we're going to write down our prove, which is A is parallel to B. Okay, and then we want to go ahead and write our converse statement. So if blank angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel. Okay, so now we're going to go back up to the information and see what it tells me. Okay, it tells me that R is parallel to H. So if R is parallel to H, which two lines are my transversals? A and B. The two they didn't list. So I'm going to circle line A and I'm going to circle line B because that's what I'm going to work within. Okay? And what are the only two angles that I'm using, Khalil? Angle 3 and angle 12. Okay? Now I just have to find an angle in this top transversal that has a relationship with 3, or an angle in this bottom transversal that has a relationship with 12. So who wants to tell me what relationship that they see? Okay, Jordan?
7.
Okay, 7 has a relationship to what? 3. Okay, so what type of angles are those? They are corresponding. So I want to write down that step that I just took. So I found that angle 3 is congruent to angle 7. And I know that because if 2 parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then corresponding angles are congruent. Okay? Now, I want to find a way to to show that 7 and 12 are also equal, but I cannot hop from this transversal to this transversal. So I've got to find it a different way. So, Grissom? Yes, very good. So we're going to look at our statement above. Angle 3 is congruent to angle 12. We also found that 3 was congruent to what? That's right, angle 7. So we're going to put 3 is congruent to angle 7 up here. And so if angle 7 is congruent to 3 and angle 3 is congruent to 12, then that means that we can transfer that congruency from 7 to 12. And so we would write that angle 7 is congruent to angle 12. And because we transferred it, we'd put transitivity. Okay, and our last step is if 7 and 12 are equal, that means that they have a relationship. So our last step is to figure out what is that relationship. So what relationship does 7 and 12 have? They are alternate interior. Okay? And so we're going to put if alternate interior angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel. And that proves that our lines are parallel. Okay, so I know these are very different from yesterday, but are they any harder? No. So the more we practice and the more examples we do, the better they're going to get.